Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Florida CCIM Lunch and Learn with our speaker, Mr. Casey Conaway, the Chief Economist for the CCIM Institute.
All right, well, welcome everybody. This is for your benefit, so don't be shy. Connecting the dots for CRE dislocation. We had 3 bullet points when we first put this together, but as y'all know, things are pretty fluid. Those 3 points were daily changes, updates on Fed actions, and misleading analyses. So I'm going to cover the daily changes in what I'm going to call Where Are We Now? The update on Fed actions, we had a really good podcast on that with CCIM National. So I'll refer most of you to that, and I'm going to replace that with a thing I'm going to call perspectives. And then the misleading analysis, I'm going to really talk more broadly about, how to think about data. We got a lot coming at it. It's going to look terrible. So where do you find the context and how not to get tripped up on it? So let's start with kind of where are we now and on the economy and what we have coming at us this week. So we have all of the jobs numbers coming at us. We have ADP tomorrow, which is private payrolls. Then we have jobless claims, which will be another shocker. And then we get the Friday BLS jobs numbers. Remember that we've been producing something in the range of 200,000 jobs a month. We won't be producing any jobs here for the past month, and these numbers will look probably pretty terrible. It'll be important to look through those analyses, particularly in the ADP, to look at by industry and what's happening, because some will do better than others. So that's all the job numbers coming. Also, we've got a number of things coming up that I would encourage you to look at. One of them is earnings. So believe it or not, you guys in Florida just had Carnival is reporting today. We also have CarMax, which will be reporting on Thursday. Then we get Walgreens. We'll get Delta on Thursday, both Walgreens and Delta on Thursday. Then on April 14th, we'll start getting all the banks and the financials. So those are going to start. It's going to be more important to look at their guidance because they will have not had the full impact of what's happened to their net interest margins from going to zero interest rates yet. They won't be showing any troubled loan type stuff or delinquent payments. So it's going to be really important to look at their guidance. We also get on April 14th, Johnson & Johnson, which will be a very important bellwether to look at consumer staples and how you might begin to bifurcate the retail area. And we also get the next day, United Healthcare. So this will begin to show us what the healthcare companies and insurance companies are looking at. So I definitely would have earnings on your radar screen. Don't look as much as the numbers and the comparisons as much as the guidance and comments that they're providing. Let me give you one good example. So the NHAB, the National Association of Home Builders, a week ago produced 10 days ago, their monthly HMI housing market index data. And while it was still strong and decent, we know it's going to fall. What was more important is that their chief economist revealed that there actually are supply disruptions already in the housing industry. A lot of the bathroom fixtures, the hardware stuff that goes into home construction really comes from China. That's going to filter into commercial real estate. Don't panic about construction loans just yet. Those are already committed. They're funded. The banks are going to continue to fund those. They'll want to see many of those projects completed because the expectation is this is more of a V-shaped, a sharp down, and hopefully a sharp recovery. So things like housing and other construction, we knew we already needed. We weren't overbuilt going into this thing. So I think construction projects are going to stay fine. They'll be funded by the banks. They may be slower in the absorption and some of the completion because of inspections, appraisals, title recordings, all the things that have to happen at the courthouse. The next one is pay attention to the NFIB, the National Federation of Independent Businesses. Their last report came out on March 9th, so it's very dated. We'll get a new one here next week on how the small businesses are holding up in their optimism. The last one in March showed it's still well over 100. So we hadn't been over 100 in the NFIB Small Business Optimism Index until Trump was elected, and it's been above 100 every month since then. So this is going to take a big nosedive, I would expect, particularly if you focus on the NAICS industry codes, 70 and 71, which are for, or 71, 72, which are for entertainment and retail establishments. Remember, we have over 600,000 small businesses in this country. They run and produce about 65% of our GDP. We've already in the last month closed, really the last almost 2 weeks, 50,000 stores. So retail and the NAICS codes related to retail are really going to look atrocious. Maybe this is the year we should skip ICSC in Las Vegas. We won't want to know what these numbers are. So those are some of the things that are coming at us. I would also encourage you to look at, I've always been a big fan of the rail traffic data. It segregates it by commodities and containers and intermodal. And with our supply chain so stretched, we're really going to see that rail is going to have to fill in where maybe some of the trucking is having some hiccups because we're not allowing truckers to stop at rest areas. Truck stops are providing limited services. The truck drivers aren't allowed to get out of their cabs at distribution centers and even use the restrooms. So we're really not treating our trucking industry quite the way it needs to be, given it's such a vital link in the supply chain. The other thing is we'll get GDP. So if you remember, we got the last numbers on finalizing Q4, and it was plus 2.1%. We're going to see the GDP numbers really plummet. But one thing to watch is imports, which is a big part of our economy, detract from GDP. So the GDP number may actually not be as atrocious as we think it could be. And a lot of that's going to be because we're not importing stuff. We haven't been importing stuff from China. So there could be some subtleties on that side of it. So that's kind of what's kind of queuing up. Look at the jobs numbers, look at the earnings numbers, some perspectives. So I've shared with you that my 3 key perspectives are to keep looking up and forward. If we don't, kind of look up or look into these numbers and we don't look forward and we keep looking backwards as how bad it is, and this is the worst it's been since 1929 or 33 or 2009, that's not going to accomplish anything. We've got to look forward into these guidance numbers to what companies are telling us is happening. And the third thing is, whatever we do in our industry, the more we engage in greatest generation type behavior, the better we're all going to be and get through this. So there's lots of good examples. Please share those, with us, and especially on our CCIM colleagues. If somebody's doing something really well or done something heroic, there was a story I shared last week. I picked up on a New Jersey pizza owner that took down his line of credit, $50,000 to pay forward all of his employees to keep going the next 90 days and maybe doing limited pizza delivery. So a couple other things that I want to do. Many of you know in the presentations that I was doing in January and February, I talked about our fiscal health and some of the things that we were looking at, given that our national debt was growing before we even had this crisis. This was already going to be the first year that we would have over $1 trillion in deficit spending since 2009, and we'd already had $23 trillion in debt. So I had a map, a real good piece that was put up and shared with us that I put in some of my slides. And it was the last analysis on it was 2018, and it looked at how the 50 states rank in terms of their overall fiscal condition. So you guys are in Florida. Those of you that I spoke to down in Miami in January noted that Florida was number 4 in the country out of all 50 states. So Nebraska and South Dakota were 1 and 2. Tennessee was 3, Florida 4. The Carolinas, North Carolina was number 9. Texas was 22. Pretty much in the southern and agricultural Midwest markets were fairly strong. The states that were in very difficult shape were New York, were California, were Illinois. I want to update that and bring that information forward for you guys. There's a piece, I give credit to our great executive director, Grayson Glaze at the Alabama Center for Real Estate. He was up reading even later than I was the past couple of nights. And the Pew Trust, the Pew Center for Trust, put out a new piece that looked at how states are in terms of their rainy day and overall fiscal funding right now, and how long could they last even if we didn't have the CARES bill or they need to supplement it. And so for overall on the rainy day funds, the median for the 50 states is only 28 days. So our states, it's great compared to 2009 and since the financial crisis. Florida, your rainy day fund is over 16 days. North Carolina, 19. Texas is phenomenal at 70 days. The best in the country is Wyoming with 397 days in its rainy day funding. That's the number of days they could run state operations. If you looked at their total balances, so all things, not just their rainy day fund, how long could they run? Florida, you're in much better shape. You're at 40 days. So you can run the state for 40 days if no revenue is coming in based on all of your balances, including your rainy day fund. The mean for the 50 states is 48 days. Here's where it gets real scary. And what concerns me about the CARES bill that was passed and the amount of pork that was put in it, Pennsylvania doesn't even have a half a day of total balances to operate its state. Illinois has less than 5 days, 4.7 days. California actually is in pretty decent shape. They're at 56 days. But this is really going to come home to roost. And I think while we're going to have to see a second CARES bill come through, because we essentially added somewhere between $800 billion and $1 trillion of pork. And if we have to do, and we are going to have to do another stimulus or rescue bill, we need a lot more beef than pork. And a lot of this is going to have to come down to the state levels. And those states that were in better fiscal situation going into here, which is what I was sharing with you in January and February, are going to do a lot better, and your balances which you can operate are going to be a lot better. That's important because the ability to stand this economy back up and who gets going and who can get supply chain operating and weather this the longest is going to be pretty important here that we look at that. There's a couple other things I want to point out that are important to us. One is on who's considered an essential service. So I want to compliment you guys. Had the first national story in Florida Trend covering this. It brought together a letter that was sent to the Governors Association around the country, all the governors and mayors that went this week, that really talked about this issue. And in particular, the appraisers were concerned about it, because really there's only about 7 states that clearly identify most of our real estate disciplines like appraisal and property management as critical. And it's really left vague in the other states. And in those states, they defer to really what is known as CISA, C-I-S-A, which some of you may know is a cybersecurity information sharing agency. In there's a general provision for supporting financial services. It's pretty broad and would encompass many of our disciplines. I would encourage many of you that are getting in your car and having to do work or travel to actually print that section out and carry it with you, or if your governor or your state is one of the states like Illinois that's done a good job defining it, to have it with you. Excuse me. I'll share why. Yesterday, on my way to a doctor's appointment, I was the only car on the major highway going to Emory University, and I got pulled over and inquired or asked what I was doing on the road, all that kind of stuff, my doctor's information. Some of these states are really cracking down in cities on people not being sheltered at home. So I would encourage you to maybe have that printed out and put in your car or easily accessible on your smartphone to understand that particular piece of information. A couple of other things that I want to point out is how we look at data and information. There was a piece I commented on and put out a couple of weeks ago, that it was actually a good piece of research that was posted by somebody out there, but they only posted part of the research. And the research was looking at what were the states that were going to be most impacted by entertainment and restaurant industry closing down and having to shutter. And what it did is it looked at the information from a standpoint of the percentage of entertainment and restaurant dollars, revenue generated in a prospective state as a percent of its GDP. So if you were a state like Maine or Montana, where you have a lot of entertainment and restaurant activity, say maybe in ski season or summer season, but you don't have much of an otherwise diverse economy, like Florida, Texas, or other states, then your percent of those NAICS codes, 71 and 72, would look very high. And so this researcher had gone through and looked at it 9 different ways, but what got posted was that Montana, Maine, and Vermont were the 3 most impacted states by entertainment and restaurant industries and business closings. That's the kind of misinformation we need to be careful of while you've got to open these reports and studies and look at them. Because really at the front half of the research that was done, the researcher gave all of the proper information and noted if you looked at total dollars of entertainment and restaurant in those states, then you'd have a much different perspective. And the top 5 states were California, New York, Texas, Florida, and Illinois. And that makes a lot of sense because total dollars is going to suggest a lot more businesses. It's going to suggest a lot more workforce and a lot more impact than, say, percent change. So one of the notes I would leave you is that looking at this plethora of data that we're going to be getting is look at how it's presented to you. I know this may be a shocker, but some entities have agendas in why and how they're producing and presenting data. And it's really incumbent upon all of us to go deeper and dig into that information. I'm trying to do some of that and put that out on say, LinkedIn posts. The CCIM is involving me as well. They've got the ccim.com/COVID-19 page, which isn't just CCIM content. It's really across the board, cross-pollinated. Anybody that has some good content or information they're putting. We're doing it at the University of Alabama. If you go to our website at acre@culverhouse.ua.edu, we've got a whole COVID-19. Lots of folks have it out there, so I'd encourage that. The last thing I would say, and I'm going to open it up, look at some of the questions in the chat box, see if we've got any questions going on here, is to comment a little bit on property types that are going to be most impacted, looking ahead at some of how real estate is already changing and going to change, and where you might be thinking about your clients or your business. So let me start with multifamily. The general consensus has been that multifamily is going to do okay. We're going to have borrowers, the property owners that are going to be given forbearance on their loans to Freddie and Fannie as long as they don't evict people and give them forbearance on rent. And all that is wonderful, except it destroys mostly a lot of the CRE finance industry, the mortgage REITs. People forget that the servicers of these loans have contracts where they have to still remit the collections that are expected as part of their servicing obligations. And so a lot of these entities, like we have headquartered here in Atlanta, Invesco, is on the verge of maybe for collapse if it doesn't get some intervention or some relief from its lenders on that stuff. And there's mark-to-market provisions and all kinds of accounting things that kick in. So the consensus is broader multifamily, workforce multifamily, as I call it, is going to be okay. But let me suggest what might not be. Student housing multifamily, because all the universities send the students home to do remote work. There are provisions in a lot of these leases for these students, and I have 2 daughters which we've actually executed on these, where if there's an act of God or an act of university that goes back to some of the school shootings at like Virginia Tech, that the landlords at these off-campus places have to allow the tenant or the students the option to cancel or get out of their lease. So we haven't looked at any of that stuff any more than we did co-tenancy clauses when we first started to see big box and anchor retail collapse, and we didn't know what that was. We forgot what those clauses were. So I'm a little more concerned about student housing. Think of all the universities and the hundreds of thousands of students that are working remote. Think of what universities are potentially, particularly state universities and private, are going to need help with in terms of they've got to rebate or provide credits for these students on their meal plans, on their student housing and dormitory plans. So the CARES bill didn't really think too much about the community colleges, our state universities. There's a whole nother area of help that we're going to need to do. Retail, it's going to be very bifurcated. Those that are involved in consumer staples, grocery stores, Walmart, Costco, drugstores, pharmacies are going to do very well. Those that are in consumer discretion, it's going online or it's even being destroyed online because entities like Amazon are focusing their supply chain on only replenishing in their warehouses essential items, and they're not replenishing or restocking what, Uncle Joe and Mary's, jewelry making business was doing. And how they were going to restock and sell and deliver that on Amazon. Most of you probably noticed the increased delays. So the e-commerce that retailers thought they could defer to help them is running into all kinds of problems. Industrial is going to stay very strong. Look at these warehouses are going to have to be replenished, filled even more. I'm on the board of directors for a public REIT known as Monmouth. All we do is logistics and warehouses. I shared a LinkedIn post yesterday where we closed just this week on a major new warehouse in the supply chain in Columbus, Ohio. Things are closing. Warehouse deals are being completed. The cap rates and whatnot are not changing that dramatically. Office, I just put a big question mark. We really don't know what this shelter in place, work remote is going to mean. I can tell you from my wife and my standpoint, we pray for the day that offices open back up so we can get the heck out of the house, away from the kids, and get back to a place where we can think and function rather than everybody being in the house. So it may not be that we all just like working from home. We may actually value an office environment once again. I think is a big question mark on office. We're seeing some other changes like telemedicine. So telemedicine is going to change a lot of things in the medical and how we deliver and technology. So on the property types, we're gonna see a lot change there. Lastly, if we're opening up questions, I'm working on a piece that we'll post tomorrow. That's called roughly Dem Bones, and it's not Democratic bones or anything political, but many of you may remember going back to our childhood and nursery days where we learned about the skeleton and the hip bones connected to the leg bone and all of that. That originally has its roots in the book Ezekiel, and was converted into a spiritual song in 1928. But the reason I'm going to use that is not to, have a religious or political position, but to get us all thinking about the sequencing of what we have to do during this virus and what we have to stand up first, second, and third in order for our economic skeleton and our CRE industry skeleton to stand up straight again. If we connect a toe bone to the hip bone and the hip bone to an elbow bone, we're not going to have a very good skeleton. So I think that's what we're wrestling through today. That's why we don't have clear answers on commercial real estate. We're going to see a lot of things change. So why don't I pause, see if that's helped you a little bit, and see what kind of questions that we have in the chat right now. So let me see in the Q&A. One of the questions from Richard is, do you foresee the moratorium on foreclosures being lifted anytime soon? Do you think job losses will cause more foreclosures, and will this happen? So I think we're going to have to see the Federal Reserve intervention here and working with Freddie and Fannie. They're the largest holders of our mortgages and foreclosures. We've been through this rodeo in the last 10 years, and we know it's a long road back. So I think they're going to do everything they can to probably forego that path again and keep a halt or a lid on foreclosures, or really the term we're learning today, the other F word is forbearance. So I think there's going to be a lot of forbearance, and what homeowners are going to realize is they didn't make mortgage payments for 3, 4, 5, 6 months, maybe longer, but that's all going to have to be restructured and put on the back of their mortgage. So they may end up with a higher balance. The question is, what kind of carnage does that do to the mortgage REITs and our mortgage servicing industry and all those industries that are really in the backside, the back office and closet of making CRE finance work? I would encourage you to follow TREP, TREPP. They're doing a great job. Another one is CREFC, CREFC. It's the Commercial Real Estate Finance Council. This is all the people, the rating agencies, the bond buyers, the mortgage REITs, all the participants. This is where the industry group that they're within, and it's pretty dire right now. Look at the piece I put out on Invesco over the weekend. They're headquartered here in Atlanta, and really, it wouldn't be impossible to see an entity like an Invesco go under. And that's in the, on the scale when you think about a Lehman or some of what happened in 2009. So while I think this is going to be a bottom-up targeted, I hate to use the term stimulus, I'd rather use rescue type of intervention, because before we gave it from a top down, we gave all the money to the banks and hoped they would do the right things. And unfortunately, not all of them behaved very well. So the focus on Congress is to get the money into the workers, the homeowners, and hopefully have it build up. But we don't know who will pay what. Let's see. Yes, we will send out the link to the audio on this, Richard. Let's see, TJ. Can you share the relative magnitude of the recent CARES Act to the total economy as we discussed earlier this week, national debt increases? So yes. So here's what I want you to keep in perspective. So we went into this thing with 23 trillion in debt. We went into this thing as a healthy, vibrant economy, taking on another $1 trillion in debt this year. And in just the last few weeks, we have added the equivalent of $5 trillion of debt. 2.2 trillion from CARES and another 2.5, 2.7 from the Fed, because they've reinflated their balance sheet to over 5 trillion. Understand how the Fed is able to do this. The Fed is able to do this by calling Treasury and saying, print some money. The Fed doesn't take credit risk. Treasury is taking the credit risk and running the printing machines. And the Fed is basically a property manager, a mortgage broker on the asset, saying, we'll buy student loans, we'll put whatever is on our balance sheet from the discount window. So this is massive. I'll share a piece with you. A good friend of mine that I've known for over a decade, he published a piece, How Monetary Policy Impacts Commercial Real Estate Values. And it really is a piece about the history of fiat currencies, F-I-A-T. That's not the predecessor to the Fiat Chrysler car company. It's an economics term that basically says it's a currency with nothing backing it. And all the world major developed countries today, all of our currencies have nothing backing them. There's not gold, there's not silver, there's not anything precious in value that's backing it. So when you start just printing the presses, there's a history of this blowing up, these fiat currencies collapsing. The most recent one was in Germany after World War II. And before that, it was China during the Song Dynasty. And before that, it was Rome when Emperor Nero decided to take silver out of the denarius coin. And all of these entities, their whole economy and their currencies collapsed. We need to be asking what if and thinking about how many more trillions we can do. How do we balance the risks of getting back to work at some point in time? And how many more $5 trillion months can we have? Because there might not be a lot to come back to. I was fairly young as a teenager when my dad was a developer involved with Vail Ski Resort during the Volcker era, and saw what happened growing up in Colorado in development when interest rates in the prime went to 21%. The inflation causes were different then, and we had an oil shock and an oil embargo that caused energy prices to skyrocket. We have exactly the opposite this time, but we're printing money like mad that at some point we're going to pay the price, because the only way you devalue and get rid of all that massive debt is you create massive inflation to devalue it. So there is a day of reckoning that we need to think about. What I like about commercial real estate is tangible assets are a way to weather that storm. So if you have clients that are worried about all of this, one of the places to sit and park your money right now is in commercial real estate or land. Look at some of the best performing sectors day in and day out right now. Real estate and REITs are some of the sectors that are going. I skipped over hospitality from Vladimir. You're right. I think, hospitality is going to be a whole industry that we have to rescue. We had already started, pretty much getting to a point of overbuilding. It was priced for a perfect storm. Occupancy rates, rental rates, RevPAR, revenue per available room, were all elevated. What we're going to have to look at hospitality, we can probably weather this if we go 60 or 90 days. If this goes into June and July and August, we're going to have to be looking at adaptive reuse for hospitality. We're going to have to be looking at really innovative strategies like universities that have hospitals that they use hotels to master lease to put their medical workforce, so that they don't take the virus home after work to their family, that they have a place where they can work 3, 4, 5-day shifts, they can get a meal. We might be looking at hospitality to master lease to help for our first responders. There's a lot of other alternative uses that we may have to be looking to state, local, and federal government to repurpose or reuse those hospitality assets in the meantime. And to the extent that they are used or offer that, maybe we look at some things, not just forbearance, but forgiveness on the loan structurings, or the Fed doing some special things at the discount window on hospitality loans. Let's see, Florida, number 4. In terms of where you are from your rainy day reserves and fiscal situation, where are you now? You're not as bad as probably, at least 56 other states. Florida's in a good position. Whether Florida emerges without having to for a period of time, put on the table a debate about an income tax or other user fees to plug the holes. Remember, you've got a lot of elderly people. You have a lot of the demographic that is most vulnerable to this virus. The wave hasn't completely got to you yet in Florida. You have very vulnerable industries in entertainment and tourism and cruise ship. So I think Florida, you're early in the discovery process, and unfortunately, there's probably a lot more bad news to come down the road. It's all the more important that maybe you guys look at being ahead of and not late to these shelter-in-place orders. You've done a good job about shutting down the beaches, but the spring breakers didn't get the notice for a couple of weeks. How will the assisted living communities sell and purchase do? Great question from John. We're going to look at how senior housing is done after this in terms of safety. The psychology of whether, you get the stories, the latest one out of Virginia, where, like we had in Washington State, where, the virus sets in and so many people die. How safe, how sanitary, what are the additional costs that are going to have to be input? Do we isolate and segment certain populations in senior and assisted living communities that are more at risk, less at risk? Those are all really valid questions. I think what it means is, it's going to get more expensive. It's going to get more complicated. And I think that people are really going to ask the question, are mom and dad or grandma and grandpa better off being isolated in a community away from these type of risks and viruses, or are they better off being at home? The other one that's going to come into play is the baby boom children of grandma and grandpa are going to, and maybe some of the millennials and Gen X are going to be asking, how do we afford these facilities in the aftermath of this crisis? Because I think we're going to have a massive hit to disposable and personal income levels. Jeff had a question on a little more on e-commerce. Where are we? So we're just starting to see, we thought all was wonderful if you could just figure e-commerce out. Then we get the Amazon story. The first leg of Amazon was we're not going to restock what isn't essential. So that really takes a hit to a lot of small businesses. I'll direct you to a great source to understand what's happening to those small businesses and sole proprietorships. It's Etsy, ETSY. Their CEO has put out some great pieces. Believe it or not, we have almost 56 million sole proprietors in this country. Over 3 million of them do all of their business online through Etsy. It's becoming a new platform, just like Shopify was building, because what do you do when Amazon shuts you off? The second story we've discovered from Amazon is what happens when you get an infected infected worker in the warehouses like Amazon did in New York, and the panic that sets in. And do we spread the virus in packages? Do we spread it with, truck deliveries? And how does that happen? All of those things are coming into question that we're going to have to look at in our supply chain. Our entire supply chain, and even on agriculture, we were talking about the embedding of blockchain into food and every kind of source. We are going to see blockchain accelerate into every aspect of e-commerce, like what IBM and Maer Shipping were doing already a year or 2 years ago, so that we can source and identify, products, agriculture, so that if something like this happens again from China, it's not just shutting down travel. It's identifying in blockchain code, shutting down every product, every ship, every container, every bit of agriculture. I don't know if many of you were ever watched, but Sunday night I was flicking around and watched Mark Levin interview with former Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich. And I did not realize that Newt Gingrich's spouse is the ambassador to Italy, and they live over there, and they're quarantined. And Newt Gingrich was sharing some insights as to why it's so bad in Italy. What happened in Italy is, in northern Italy, the Chinese, when they moved into Italy to buy many of the high-end luxury name brand retail products, purses, clothing, and whatnot, they wanted to fight the battle that all of that was shipped to China and it wasn't Italian made anymore. So China exported over 100,000 workers to run the companies of all of these luxury brands that they bought in northern Italy. And that's part of why Italy is so decimated. China didn't share what was going on. A lot of those Chinese workers went home in December, back to China, to get ready for the Chinese New Year. When it got canceled and the virus was already rampant, they went back to Italy and have created this massive outbreak in Italy that's spreading to Spain and throughout Europe. So the whole e-commerce thing is going to get a lot more complicated. Here's some good and bad news about what we're seeing on the rebuild of supply chain. So on the supply chain, some of the things that we're seeing happening are China is actually loading ships and boats again. They're sending them to the to our way. They're heading to LA Long Beach. I asked a couple of people who've asked to be not identified in the shipping industry, what's going to happen with those vessels that are en route to LA and Long Beach with California having a statewide shelter-in-place order. And they said, they're probably not going to reroute them this early stage through the Panama Canal to come up into Houston or Port Freeport or Port Mobile, because it actually is cheaper for them to just sail into LA and Long Beach and just sit there anchored and wait for California and maybe a presidential mandate to open up the LA Long Beach ports in some way. So we have supplies that are starting to come. I think also what we're going to see on e-commerce is it's going to change as we see industry and manufacturing change where it is located and what it does. We were learning out of the tariffs in terms of how much of our supply chain came from Asia. This just further elevates it. And many more sectors of all of our industry are going to be coming back to the U.S. or back to geographies that are friendly to the United States in commerce. And I think we're going to see a really massive upheaval in China because of this. When we had our AcreCom conference February 7th, we had all the CEOs of the major industries. And we asked them all for one bold prediction. This is February 6th or February 7th in Birmingham, Alabama. And your CEO of CCIM said, my prediction is that in 2020, China is going to be the most disruptive factor in our economy. Whether he already knew what was going on with the virus, whether he was just that fortuitous, but Greg was spot on and very fortuitous to noting huge disruption from China. I put a cautionary mark on here. Remember why Japan bombed us in Hawaii and Pearl Harbor. We put an oil embargo around Japan and kind of put a noose around their neck from being able to get to energy and oil. As we react to this and rebuild e-commerce and industry and everything else, we need to be thoughtful about whether we put too tight a noose around the neck of China. They're not a lightweight power. They're they're several times, 5 times our population, 6 times our population. They do have, military strength and ability. So before we overreact, we need to think through that. Last question to see here, Jeff. Any thoughts on retail? I think I touched some of that. And then from Jill, where are you posting all these articles? So a lot is on LinkedIn. I do 3-4 a day on really good pieces, and I'll give you about a 5 to 10 sentence, what it means, why it's important, so if you don't have time to read it. So I do a couple of 3 of those a day. I'm working closely with the communication teams at CCIM, Rich and Larry on the communication teams, and Greg Fine and Eddie Blanton are all over it. You see, we've already had 3 podcasts out in the last week. Also, the University of Alabama, our Acre site, we're doing a lot. Some of it is Alabama-concentric. A lot of it is more macro. We have a COVID-19. A lot of my more thoughtful pieces like the how the hip bone is connected to the leg bone and everything that we'll post to tomorrow. One last one, an anonymous attendee. Do you foresee manufacturing plants to diversify outside of China into other parts of Southeast Asia, Mexico, and U.S.? And the answer is absolutely. But my cautionary remark is we got to be careful and remember our lessons that we forget in history of why Japan felt its need to strike on us in World War II in Pearl Harbor. We put too tight a noose around Japan with the oil embargo, and that caused them to feel like they had no alternative. We need to think about that lesson as we go forward with China in the response. So why don't I pause there? It's 12:40. I can keep going. So Lauren or CSAM Florida, do you want to give me some guidance? I'm trying to think. There's one other question. Single tenant net lease properties, Dollar General, AutoZone. Not sure if you have any info. Yes, and you're going to see tremendous earning news come out of there. So Monmouth, the public REIT I'm in, every asset we have is a triple net to a credit tenant lease. FedEx, Toyota, all those type entities, Amazon. And we're doing fine. Our stock has kind of been beaten up by everybody, but as people start to step out and see what we offer an inflation protection. We offer pretty much as close to a guaranteed cash flow stream as you can find. These triple net lease properties that are really that are critical to, I think, what I call consumer staples rather than discretion, I think you're going to come out of here doing very well. And that at some point, whether it's 6 months, 12 months, or 24 months, you'll see many of these names. I think you can see them go 50, 100, 200% up in price. So I'm very optimistic on the single tenant net lease structure. There's going to be fewer of these deals done over the next 6 months. The banks, keep in mind what's going on in banks. Banks are 100% focused now. I speak to groups of them every day, all over the country. They're completely locked down on dealing with the CARES bill, dealing with how to do loan modifications, deal with their existing customers and their existing credits. There's not a lot of focus on new business. They don't have the resources to generate a whole lot of new business. It's triage right now. So if you've got something, if you've got a construction loan, if you have a subdivision underway, if you've got any of these deals, they're going to become incredibly valuable as we have a shortage of supply. And keep in mind, we had a dearth of this stuff going into this period of time. So those are all really great questions. So why don't I pause and see if we want to wrap. I want to make sure we thank our sponsors. This wouldn't be possible without them. And they've been scrolling. I also want to make sure that you've got a couple of those key website links and maybe a few others that I've mentioned and gone through here. So top of list, ccim.com/COVID-19. And what I love what the Institute has done for your members, it's not just CCIM content. If I send them something that's on a real good piece, like this Pew Trust deal on states and their reserve funding, they're putting that up. If CREFC has a good piece, if TREP has a good piece, if IRM has a good piece, they are putting all of that stuff up there. So they're engaging what I call really good cross-pollination attitude. We are going to come out of this realizing that our peers across disciplines can help us in many ways. So I did a NAIOP call, I guess the end of last week, and we had Denise Fromming and the IRM leadership with Jim Amram, from the CEO from the Appraisal Institute, and we talked about what is a solution for appraisers that can't do property inspections during this virus. Well, one of the answers is the property managers have virtual tours of all the space. They also have photos that they do every year for the insurance policy renewals. And so the property managers in that discipline can help the appraiser with supplementing the inability to do an inspection and still have it be a credible or reliable appraisal. We're going to find those type cross-pollination activities, and what the Institute's doing for you at ccim.com/COVID-19 is great. I want to make sure you have and the University of Alabama, our website at ACRE, A-C-R-E, .culverhouse, all one word, culverhouse.ua.edu. We've got a whole thing, all of my pieces, we're putting detailed content, and we're not just posting a lot of information, we're trying to put context and tackle different issues, like when the CARES bill passed, or Fed intervention and all that type of stuff. The last ones, I encourage you, look at the earnings that start. We go, believe it or not, into earnings season here, full bore on April 14th with all the banks. We have several that are relevant to you guys this week in Florida, Carnival and CarMax. Look at those. Look at the guidance. Don't look at how bad the numbers are, what the decline was. Look at what they're telling you they're seeing on the ground and forward guidance and what they're doing. Or, for example, like a Gap is shifted over to making masks. So a Gap may come out of this better than some other type of retailer. Bacardi is making hand sanitizer. So many of our industries are doing things that we might not thought of. In Alabama, where I'm located, we're a major car manufacturing company. All of the car manufacturers have idled production, but they've shifted over to making ventilators. They've shifted over to making all kinds of medical type equipment. So the job loss may not be as bad as we thought from just idling all of the plants there. Look at NFIB, the National Federation of Independent Businesses. Look at the rail traffic data. It's at AAR.org, the American Association of Railroads. It's like $110 a year, but I'll post things out there. But every month they'll tell you what's happening on rail. It'll tell you what's happening with cargo coming into our ports and being brought in to restock our supply chain. It'll also tell you what we're sending back out, what we're manufacturing to send out to the rest of the world. Don't freak over the jobless claims on Thursday. Don't freak over the jobs numbers tomorrow. We've expected this. The last thing is you're going to hear a lot of discussion about what type of a whole new alphabet of things and what type of recession or depression are we going into. So you're going to hear, letters like, is it a V recession? That's a real sharp one that we drop in real sharp and we come back out. You'll hear about a U-shaped one. That's one that drops and then sits in the bottom for an extended period of time before recovering. You'll hear about the dreaded W. That's a double dip recession. And then you'll hear about the one where we all just go away, the wrong shaped L, where we just drop and we never come back up. Let's hope we're not there from the Great Depression or from the polio outbreak. Keep in mind the difference between a recession and a depression. So there's no official recognized definitions by the national NBE, our National Bureau of Economic Research, but generally a recession is 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP. A depression is something we haven't seen since 1919 to 1921 in the Great Depression in the 30s, and that is where you see unemployment rise above 10%. You see GDP contract continuously at minus 10% or greater levels for years, not months or quarters. And generally, it's got to be about 3 years. I don't think we're in that bucket. I think that we will probably stand this economy back up over the summer. And hopefully we get back to work. We figure out how to survive. One last tentacle that I'll give you to think about, because many of us live in subdivisions that may have amenities and homeowners associations. So I live in one that has pool and tennis court. We rely on annual renewal memberships. We rely on the swim team to help fund the shortfalls, and that is an activity. We're hearing from local leaders here that they're within 30 days away of putting out an order not to open any public pools and to cancel all swim team type activities and tennis activities. If that happens, we're going to see HOA after HOA in community and subdivision after subdivision go bankrupt. Why does that matter to you? It matters to you because many of those are structured that creates a lien on your house and your property as well. And we have a whole nother wrinkle that the Fed will have to deal with. And it was one of the complicating factors when I was at the Fed for how do we deal with these foreclosures, especially in subdivisions that had HOAs and we had liabilities. Someone had to step up and clean those out. So hopefully this was helpful. We'd like to continue and do these each week. We want your feedback. And we'd like your feedback. So if there's particular topics, I can address those. Otherwise, we'll kind of deal with the fluid situation as we go. So give us your feedback. What things would you like me to talk about? Be safe out there. Hang in there. Thank you.